Um, Hello, everyone. Welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce today Jean-Nicole Melon Saint-Laurent, who is an associate professor at and currently the director of graduate studies in the Faculty of Theology at the Marquette University. Her PhD was awarded in 2009 from Brown University, and she published her first book, Missionary Stories and the Formation of the Syriac Churches, with the University of California Press in 2015. More recently, she co-authored with Kyle Smith, The History of Mar Benham and Sarah, the martyrdom and monasticism in medieval Iraq with Gorgias Press in 2019. And among other writings that she published, Jean-Nicole is one of the editors for Syriaca.org, where she co-edited Gateway to the Syriac Saints, a 2-volume digital database of the Syriac Saints and their lives. And today we get to hear about her most recent research project. Jean-Nicole, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I think everybody is on an afternoon. I don't think we have anyone zooming in from North America, so I appreciate your flexibility with the time. I'd like to share today a general overview of a project that I have been working on on the topic of food in early Christianity, which is an enormous topic. And in fact, when people have heard that, they said, well, how are you going to write a book on that? And so I'm going to explain the parameters of this study and what I'm attempting to show, and hopefully get some feedback about the general, the sort of the landscape of my book as it's evolving. So this is a work in progress, and I'm happy to share, welcome your comments then. And I will share my PowerPoint now. Here we go. Can you see? I can't see you now. Let me see. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Oh, it's not come across just yet.
Okay, sorry. We practiced this, and of course, okay.
Sounds about right.
All right, share. All right, now.
Yep.
Yeah. Ça?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Okay. So a quick introduction. A change of pace, the power and paradoxes of food in ancient Christianity highlights the theological significance of food, gluttony, and gustation in ancient Christian discourse, focusing primarily on Syriac sources. Of course, as we all know here, scholars have written much on eating in the early church, meals, asceticism, and the senses. And this book is building on some of this earlier research. It expands on this scholarship as it illustrates how I'm arguing ancient Christians discuss food and eating to teach their audience about humanity's wounded nature and God's will to heal it. So my interest is really theological in this project, looking at a sort of the bigger theological narrative connected with eating, fasting, gluttony, etc. While contemporary people worry about gluttonous waste, excess, and addiction, particularly in my country, most are unaware of the theological roots of food anxieties and the remedies, indeed, that ancient Christians offered for them. And so I'm not concentrating in this book on fat studies, body aesthetics, ancient dieting, or ancient medicine, but rather I'm looking at a paradox as what I see is a paradox in Christian theology and how Christian authors expanded on it. And this paradox is that eating distanced humanity from God in the Adam and Eve story. However, of course, Christ will commission the church to feed, and through the feeding of the Eucharist, to redeem. And so food is at the center of this paradox. And I'm arguing that The paradoxical powers of food become a central theme in Christian exegesis, ascetic texts, and narratives. And so I'll be sharing with you this morning, this afternoon, some of the sources that I'm looking at. And it's a very, very limited source. Again, I can't, if I were to attempt to highlight all the ways in which ancient authors, Christian authors talked about these things, I would never finish this book. So I'm trying to show how ancient Christians used food imagery and discourse on eating to explore the transience of the human person and also the spirit's longing for God. Is that clear? Does that make sense? Okay, good. And I'm sure this here is a picture actually from the Milwaukee Art Museum of Jacques Delange. He's a Belgian artist, and it's an illustration of the vice of gluttony. And it was this picture actually that inspired me to think of this project, because it occurred to me in contemporary theology, the vice of gluttony is completely divorced of any theological connections today. It is still considered a problem and a vice, but I was curious about the theological roots of this vice and looking more deeply into that. And so, as you know, and this is great to be speaking to such a well-informed audience. So I have seen in the Christian discourse that humanity has a food dilemma, as what I'm calling it. It goes back to the story of Adam and Eve. So from its very first chapters, the Christian Bible, and here again, I'm very particular here to emphasize, this is a Christian Bible. This is the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Christian Bible presents an entangled and at times woeful relationship between God's people and their food and drink. God creates man and woman, as we know, in the Garden of Eden, and gives them all that they need with no requirements except they not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Yet the serpent, whom Christians identify with Satan, tricks Eve. Eve eats from the forbidden fruit and gives it to Adam. Adam and Eve's foolish choice then links food, desires of the senses, disordered love, and death, infecting how people will misapprehend and misuse the good things that God created for them. So their disobedient consumption will alienate them and their children from God, and also break their bonds with each other. But for Christians, this is resolved with the coming of Jesus, the incarnation of God. The incarnate God comes, Christ comes. What does he do? First, he fasts. So he starts to return the story, to undo the sin of Adam through a fast, through rejecting Satan's offering of bread, turn bread, stones into bread, and then he feeds. So then food itself will get restored through Christ. He will feed throughout his life, and then, of course, give himself as bread in the Eucharist. So I'm showing that what I've seen is an arc of the place of food and the story of humanity's, we can call it fall. I know that's not perhaps appropriate in Eastern Christianity. Let's say estrangement, sickness from Adam and Eve, and then so the story of the creation, consumption, eating, infection. And I'm using this term infection because, for instance, Ephraim the Syrian will talk about this inclination towards disobedience, this inclination towards pride or gluttony as an infection that somehow humanity has acquired, like a poison from the serpent. So he talks about it very much as a sickness, infection, the incarnation, and then the redemption. So those are the 5 kind of points around which I'm writing this book. And I'm also considering too how, in the terms of Christian anthropology, what does it mean to be a person created in the image and likeness of God? And what does it mean if God became a person, if God became flesh, if God gave us himself as flesh to eat? What does that mean for humanity? So I'm looking to at these questions as a lens into the theological anthropology of the early church. So I'm already conscious of the fact that I've spoken for 10 minutes, so I'm going to watch my time. I have a horrible tendency, I'm sure none of you ever do this, to be too long-winded. So I'm going to keep on keep on task here. So yes, as I said, humanity's food dilemma, and I've seen this too. It's a lasting, as much as gluttony has lost its theological, let's say, contours. There's a lasting anxiety that people have about eating and our discomfort with our desires of eating and what that might mean about our mortality, and how gluttony, as many authors will say, like Evagrius, for instance, will be identified as the gateway vice. It's the vice that leads to other vices. So it has that lasting impact as well. And of all the vices too, gluttony is the most visual. So there's an incredible, you could do a whole project just on images of gluttony in Christian art. It's incredible. Often pigs are involved, not always. Okay. So for many early Christian fathers, including John Chrysostom and others, Eve and Adam and Eve, their sin is actually the vice of gluttony, and that we will lose our immortality through Eve's eating and through the food that she gives to Adam, that our estrangement from God can be traced to this act. And it's really interesting then to see as where ancient Christian exegetes take this wider theme and run with it in different directions. But it's a problem because they will always have to come back to, it's not a problem, but the challenge for them becomes, how can food become something good? If this was the way that humanity fell, how can eating together become something good again? Of course, this will be resolved, I'm arguing, through the incarnation. Also, in the Bible, of course, Jesus himself will get accused of gluttony. And so it's interesting to see that even within the New Testament, there's a tension about food. I mean, you could certainly do a whole book just on the New Testament and food. But Jesus himself does fast, indeed, but he's most of the time he's feeding and he's eating, and he's even accused of gluttony by his detractors. But as I said, the story gets unturned when Jesus will refuse to turn stones into bread. So the undoing of Adam's sin. I think I'm watching the time. I think I'm going to just follow through my PowerPoints rather than read my paper, because I think that's probably better. So I can, and then we can all, I have more to say within the paper if it comes up then in the Q&A.
There is still time. There is still time. No worries at all.
Okay. Thanks. So as I said, the creation, again, these are the themes that I'm looking at. The creation, a food's role in tying these together. Consumption, I know that these are not images from Syriac or from ancient, but they still illustrate the greater point here. I love this picture of the snake as a female, which is kind of interesting. Well, she looks female to me. I don't know, maybe she's. And then infection, again, the infection of Adam and Eve, the inclination, the resolution through the incarnation, and then the redemption through the heavenly banquet, which is anticipated, of course, for Christians in the Eucharist. And so each time that Christians, according to Christian theology, share the Eucharist, it's a typological foretaste of the heavenly banquet to come. And so the circle comes full. And yet the Eucharist, too, is a resolution of the vice of gluttony, because, in fact, the Eucharist is the quintessential anti-gluttonous meal. It's the meal in which gluttony is repudiated. It's a meal in which there's an absence of inappropriate desire. Rather, all the desire has been resolved into something of love, directed towards the love of God. The first chapter of my book, however, is just focused on the theme of and the vice of gluttony, the down part of food, and as it was understood. So I have to show that, of course, many ancient Christian philosophies, including the Stoics, the Neo-Pythagoreans, of course, Hellenistic Jews, worried about excessive eating and drinking and the food and the danger that that had on one's relationship with God and one's behavior. Christians were not inventing this, certainly not arguing that. However, they will take it in a different direction, as many of you know. The person who is most responsible for that will be Evagrius of Pontus, who will call gluttony a demon, and indeed the first demon to attack a monk. But even before that, you see a concern for excess. So I look in this first chapter too at the writings of Clement of Alexandria on his expansion on proper table etiquette for the Christian in his Pedagogikos. For instance, the idea that your eating is a reflection of your Christianity, and so there was this idea that there would be a proper way to handle this, and that a turn to excess, and as Cashin will later expand, there were different types of gluttony. It's important to note. It wasn't just eating in excess, it was also luxuriant eating. It was also the eating that would deprive the poor of their food. And so there were various aspects of that vice, which will get discussed in Christian authors. This is that, as I said, I will discuss. So like the Neo-Pythagoreans, they made a direct link. They saw the direct relationship, for instance, between excessive hunger and excessive eating, and then the sort of slippery slope into lust and lack of control of sexual desires. This is a very famous image of gluttony from Hieronymus Bust here. You can see, as I said, there's always with this vice a connection with death. I think that's really important to see, that people really saw that excessive eating could lead to your death. You really could eat yourself to death, or it could lead to the death of other people, because if you're excessive, then you might be causing other people unnecessary hunger. And of course, the mortality, humans' mortality and our death, always linking back to the story of Adam and Eve. So when Evagrius of Pontus then considers this vice, when he considers eating in the life of the monk, he will elaborate upon gluttony, the demon of gluttony, calling it a demon in many of his writings. And he will also connect different remedies for it. And as many of you know who've worked on Evagrius, the most famous will be the talking back. So I think I have a slide on this. Yes. So just to say, for him, gluttony is a distraction on the pathway to God. So he says, when you're distracted by, and any of you who've ever gotten really hungry when you're trying to study will know that this is something real. I mean, we think these guys are, there's nothing new under the sun. I find this all the time. I sit down to work, I'm ready to go, and suddenly I want a snack, So anyhow, and then I'm distracted, and then I lose a half an hour. Anyhow, so he's saying that this blurs the vision of God. And so he talks about it in those terms. And memories. I think this is another important connection. When you're focused on only what you're eating, you're not thinking about your duties to God. So it's the sort of the problem of an obsession about anything, the psychological level, we might say. And he prescribes various remedies in his Antiretikos for fighting this demon. And this is how he calls the demon of gluttony the one who tempts monks away from proper fasting, makes a monk ungrateful for simple food. So that's really interesting too. It's this idea that you're not happy with what you have, makes him recall the tasty foods and wine from the world, and persuades the monk not to share with the poor. So that gives it the various aspects of this vice. It's much more as you see, I would say that this is a lot more of a richer understanding of what this vice is than in the way, at least in the English language, the word gluttony is used. I don't know how that is in your other cultures, but for us, it's something just always about excessive eating and drinking. It's lost the other connotations. Certainly not an offense to God. Might be offense to other people, but and then Cashin will. It's already 10:20, huh? Maybe I go for 5 more. I don't know, Dan. What do you think? I have a lot more to say, but I don't want to.
Feel free to take at least 5 minutes.
Okay.
Maybe 5 minutes. Would that help?
Yeah, I'm gonna take 5 more minutes.
Excellent.
I will get you oriented with a few other things that I'm doing, and John Cashin will fine tune this vice even further. He'll say that it's even gluttony even counts if you want to eat before mealtime. So I guess I definitely wouldn't have lasted under Cashin's tutelage. So Fluorescence of Mabug. So I do have a focus on Syriac sources in my project because that's my love, that's my specialty. Fluorescence of Mabug, who, as many of you know, expands upon Evagrius and his work, will have one of his memoir on gluttony actually focuses on caricaturing what a gluttonous monk would be and what a horror that would be. So he teaches his monks to avoid this vice, we might say, by showing how that's the antitype. So he creates an antitype. The gluttonous monk is the antithetical monk. So he tries to discuss them. Now, in Syriac literature, it's also important to note that gluttony's association with death takes on an even more literal connotation. Sheol and death himself, those things get kind of conflated up in Syriac literature, but the Sheol itself is a gluttonous creature who just consumes. And this is, of course, a later image from another culture, but it's the same idea. I mean, it's in Dante as well, right? That this idea that Satan himself is chewing on us at all times and it is waiting to swallow us whole. And so again, there's a typological fulfillment that Christ will come and as St. Ephrem will say, he will kill, he will disgorge, he make him vomit. It's a very vivid image, make him vomit out the souls to redeem us then from this gluttonous soul. So if you're acting like a ravenous person, you're imitating Satan himself. That's what Philoxenus says. Basil of Caesarea will expand on social gluttony, and he's got several homilies on feasting and fasting. And he talks about, actually, it's interesting to note too, and I talk about this in my book, that the fathers who worked in monasteries versus the fathers who worked in pastoral contexts, they handle these issues with food differently. And I would say that people like Basil, people like Ephrem, who are working in more pastoral, they're a little more gentler in how they speak about gluttony, but because I think they see that people are hungry around them. There's hunger in the late ancient world. So how can a hungry person or poor person be a glutton? It doesn't make sense, right? So, but they're actually more concerned about the danger of the feast. And so more average, normal believers are going to be attracted to the church for her feast. And Basil was concerned that feast, the feasting, like the feastings of Easter, just like you would fast so much during Lent that it would lead to overindulgence at Easter. So just one more, it's already way too much time. I have just in closing, I expand on all of these types of themes. I also look in the last part, in the middle part of my book on the theme of sacred taste. So I expand on the notion of the redemption of the sense of taste, looking at the authors, Pseudo-Macarius, as well as St. Ephrem. He's obviously a very popular author in my book. And then the final part is on hagiography. And food in the saints' lives is a huge topic as well. I'm just looking at a select number of hagiographies, including Theodoret, The Life of Mary of Egypt, to show how food plays out on that. And it certainly plays out differently in the lives of holy women. And finally, sources on the Virgin Mary. I guess I could close with that point since I'm running out of time. But the Virgin Mary, and as I'm arguing at the end of the book, presents a resolution in the person, sort of a resolution of all food dilemmas, because she is the new Eve. She's the new Eve who says yes to God. And in apocryphal stories about Mary, for instance, like the Proto-Gospel of James, Mary is fed by an angel. So there's this idea that she's even prepared to receive Jesus through a special kind of food. And then what does she do? After having saying yes to God, she turns around and then becomes God's feeder. So she's the one who will actually feed God in the incarnate baby. So the whole narrative gets resolved actually in Mary's story, and some interesting apocryphal stories about Mary too, feeding, getting hungry. Some of you might know the date palm stories about Mary fleeing into Egypt and getting hungry, and Christ commanding the date palm to feed his mother. So there's just a few. This is a very brief overview of my bigger project. As I said, I'm really just looking at a bigger narrative in select ancient Christian authors on this theme. I welcome your comments, so thank you. I will stop sharing. And I'm happy to send the fuller PowerPoint if people are curious, since I didn't really get a chance to talk about most of it. I always do that.
Thank you very much, Jeanne-Nicole, for this very interesting paper. I have already several questions. Maybe I will start with one and then we open the discussion. So you mentioned the fact that gluttony has a special place in a way, and I know in Evagrius is the first of the negative thoughts, and also in Isaac the Syrian it's quite important. So why do you think it's first? Is it related to like a grasping attitude, like that then allows all the other thoughts to get in? Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, they call it the gateway vice, and so it's something because people have said, what does he mean by that? And I think it's the one that's hardest to avoid if you're a monk. So there's that piece too. I mean, you can renounce. Let's say you can be a celibate, but you can't live without food. And so there's a sort of mundane nature to it, perhaps in the beginning, that it's just when you sit down to begin your practice, you might be troubled by fasting. You're told to fast, so the first thing that you experience is hunger. And so my hunch is that it's something like that. Now we know, of course, it's interesting to think about. Any topics with fasting right now are really interesting because there's a lot of contemporary medical stuff on fasting and what it does to your brain. You know, after you pass through a fasting period, in fact, you can have moments of great clarity. They've studied this, but it's hard to know if those types of things map out equally in the same way in the ancient world. But I think it was just the idea that knowing that your sexual desires could be quelled through fasting. It was the idea that you can get this one under control if you can pray even when you're hungry, if you can do your duties to God even when you're hungry, or just relying on a little bit of simple food, then that is the first step towards freedom. I think that's what he meant. That I'm welcome to, and I see that as a very harsh way. I don't see that as a way that most people could have handled it. I don't think that was for everyone. And so, as I said, I'm curious to see the gentler approaches of the sort of non-monastic, less aesthetically intense authors.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's very interesting. It's as if this impulse to eat, it's very primary in a way, like, yeah. Albert and Georgia. Albert first.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I thought always that Genesis 3 was not about gluttony, but about knowledge of good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
For in paradise there was no hunger.
Right.
It's another problem, I think.
Exactly, and there's a lack of consensus about why Eve eats, even among Christian exegetes. They don't agree about what it was. Was she hungry? Was her body hungry? Was it the desire for knowledge? Was it that in the Bible it says the fruit was beautiful and nice to look at? So then there's this aspect too. It's unclear.
No, it's
The
not.
only
They could eat from all the trees, but not from one.
but not from one, right? And so so what would you how could I better perhaps articulate that?
I think it's not about gluttony, but about being as God.
Just the desire for God. And so
and not about gluttony. That's a typical later problem, I think. Not
a later
from the Hebrew Bible.
So that's a later Christian
influence
take on it, right? Okay, yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Thank you
both. Maybe both aspects are there, like also, I mean, according to which author and which aspect we examine. But Georgia has a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, I have a couple of questions. It was really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to the book. I was fascinated by 2 points in particular, and one was when you mentioned that in your sources you have differences in authors that talk to a monastic community and authors that talk to a wider public. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on that, because I've always found it fascinating to see the difference between practice, like what did common people do, and the theoretical ideas behind that. And the other things that I wanted to ask you to expand, and you already mentioned a couple of things in your paper, is what differences you saw, like what are the characteristics that are particularly pertaining to the Syriac word? If you saw any differences, anything in particular, or if it's just elaborating on previous thoughts. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, well, for instance, to take St. Ephrem as an example, his homilies on fasting don't, let's say, he doesn't presume that fasting just for its own sake is necessarily a good thing. And I think that's very interesting. So he doesn't promote the practice of fasting just for its own sake. Rather, he will give examples of fasts from the Hebrew Bible that were bad fasts, like the fast. He's got a sort of a catalog of how you shouldn't approach your fasting, for instance. And then he'll turn around and say, but this is the mindset that you should be fasting. It's to it's in preparation, he'll say, for the feast. So for Ephrem, for instance, it's never just fasting in and of itself, but rather it's the way that you will heal yourself through this sickness that you've acquired or that you've inherited from Adam and Eve. It's a sort of gentle remedy. And then he takes it one step further in saying, after you've prepared yourself, then you can receive the true divine food, the medicine of life, as it's called in Syriac, the Eucharist. And so, but it's not, let's say, discussed in a way that like to the modern ear. And we have, I think, a tendency in asceticism when we study the ascetics of the early church to think, well, that's very extreme. It's interesting. We can exoticize it. But when you read, for instance, his homilies on fasting, it's a lot gentler, and it's sort of more even perhaps useful, if I dare say so. And then I think it's also noteworthy to say that the considering like gluttony as a demon was very much mapping out onto male lives, and so you don't see in the lives of the saints, the women saints, they're not struggling with this in the same way. At least it's not talked about in the narratives in the same way. One exception is the life of Mary of Egypt. She talks about longing for the wines of Egypt. When she's out in her desert, that's what she's missing. And so it's an interesting question to the extent that wine is also a part of this. I think it probably is, because it can, abuse of wine can, cloud you up and as well. So, and then to read Basil on the fasting and the feasting, it does really feel quite contemporary sometimes, because you'll feel it's this idea still that there are people who only come to church for the feast. I mean, that's still a phenomenon in modern religions, that they don't attend the liturgy most of the year except once a year when there's a party going on. And so he's mindful of the fact that this isn't the right spirit of how we should be approaching these things. That you have to take that the Christian life is ordered, our time is ordered in our seasons of feasting and fasting. We can't have one without the other, so to speak.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Brett, please.
Yes, thank you for your contribution. I enjoyed it a lot. There are lots of loose threads that I'm thinking of that I can't really remember specific citations with reference to. But one thing I was wondering about is whether you have encountered any surprises in the exegesis on the miracle of the fish and the loaves. And what inspired this question is I was speaking with a monk from Murat Sednaya, who's based in Syria, and he told me that the Syriac word mbarech has connotations both of thanksgiving and of blessing. And he said that, this miracle of Christ is not only blessing, but is also giving thanks in a way that corrects the sin of Adam, where he just eats of the fruit, which when he shouldn't have, and kind of usurping. So so in a general way, what I've noticed is that and you picked up on this, and you articulated it clearly when talking about Christ's fasting, that there's this very broad view of Christ's atoning work. It's not just the cross, it extends throughout his life and ministry. And that's something that the Syriac tradition is especially attuned to. I was wondering though about the miracle of the fish and the loaves, whether that has been something that you've seen anything done with in an interesting way.
Yes, certainly in Ephraim as well as Jacob of Saruz. And I'm not recalling right now their precise exegesis on that story, but what he does say, Ephraim does say, is that Christ is the provisioner. And so this is really interesting. So Ephraim corrects the fact that he says, well, your detractors called you a glutton, but actually you are a provisioner. You weren't abusing food and drink. You were giving it to people. And so that is his great, that's his sort of remedy to that title, I would say. Christ was a provisioner. And then he says, yes, you wouldn't change stones into bread, Jesus, but you did change water into wine. And I love that. So it's this idea that Christ is not rejecting food per se, but again, he's healing gluttony. Christ, and that's Ephraim even says, our gluttony, O Lord, you healed by your fast. And so the Christian fast then is an entering into that story. It's not just fasting for disciplining the body. It's this typological, liturgical piece that's so pronounced, I think, in the Syriac authors. And I'm sure there's a lot on the loaves and fishes that I need to look at still. So I appreciate that. I'm sure that it's there. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Brett. Also in the chat wrote thank you. And Dan, do you have a question?
I thought I saw Alberto,
Alberto.
raising his hand first.
Alberto first, yes.
Still muted, Alberto.
Alberto, me? I don't know if my hand was, but I have a lot of questions, especially about Ephraim and his context, his literary and ideological context. Because when I read a lot of Kephalaia and Psalms of Mani, I find a contradictory vision of food, as you have well underlined also for Orthodox authors. On one side, of course, food is something that is pertaining to matter, to hyle, to darkness. On the other side, the light that is spread in the world is something that is sweet, and Christ is sweet, and light is sweet. So I ask myself if the food imagery that is very frequent in the Manichaean literature, and also the idea of a banquet, the idea of fasting, all those this great constellation of ideas concerning food is something that was in common between different trends, but also was something that was contended, was a point of struggle between the different trends. I only wanted to to advance an hypothesis. For example, when the gospel says that Jesus is a glutton, the plenary of Jesus, this is an image, of course, that was commented upon a lot of Orthodox authors. But it is interesting that also Martin, in some way, used this image to contrast, to put in contrast Jesus on one side and John the Baptist on the other. And John the Baptist is the representative of the old economy. So only to say that the field is very rich. And we should also take into account that probably the same symbols could be also used in a different way according to the different theological positions. For the rest, I believe that it is a very good research, and also with a contradiction that is typical of all biblical religions, in the sense that on one side you have to asceticism as a principle that is important, the body, the discipline of the body. On the other side, you have the image of the banquet with God and to eat God. So all those people are inside a great contradiction.
Yes, I really appreciate your comments, and I have to somehow articulate how the challenge of a project like this, if any of you have ever tried to do it, when there are so many things that one could say, is to try to say anything that's really worth saying. So, but I appreciate that very much, especially, and I appreciate thinking about the Manichaean sources. I remember reading once that the cucumber was a sacred food for the Manichaeans. Are you familiar with this tradition? Because it's very light, that this was a good food to eat, you know, and as you say, connected to this idea that the lighter a food is, then the holier it is, or the more healthier it is even. But it's interesting that throughout, Jacob of Saruz has a running sort of tag on a lot of his homilies on food, which is Christ's food is the food which you can be translated either produces no waste or should not go to waste, or it doesn't go to waste. So there was this idea that there's a discomfort, I think, with food in the fact that it becomes waste. And then what do you do with that? And so again, start trying to set up a contrast with the eternal food, which somehow you're eating a food, which is Christ, which is eternal, which cannot die. And yet somehow it's coming as bread, which obviously is still bread, you know, so it gets into a lot of paradoxes there too with the sacraments and the role of the sacrament. So there's a lot I'm going to have to say to show the limits of what I'm trying to do, because otherwise there will just be 5 million. I mean, it would be my hope that maybe someone else could take up and test this theme among other sources to see if it works or how. And as of course, as you point out too, food is always a way that the ancient religions used to distinguish themselves. This is what we eat, this is what we don't eat, and this is what they eat, and so on. Thank you. Grazie.
Thank you. And Dan, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very interesting. Glad to hear about this in this context. And I look forward to the book. I'm curious about one thing. I'm basically developing on one of the things that Alberto said. Are you, because if I understand correctly, you're going to look at the Greek as well and then Syriac context. Do you, from what you've seen already and from what you know, do you expect that the image that we get from the Syriac authors will be the same, vaguely different, or radically different? Like, for instance, if gluttony is a problem with a Greek author like Evagrius to begin with, does it become a softer thing with the Syriac authors, or do they overcorrect and because an even bigger thing? What's your feel about that? I'm very curious.
Yes. Well, this is what I'm testing. I think that it goes with the Syriac authors. I think it sort of goes in a circle. I mean, obviously Ephraim doesn't know Evagrius. It's, you know, that's chronologically not possible. But Ephraim knew asceticism, of course. So there was ascetics. There were plenty of them in his world, and so I think he's probably responding to other, let's call them Gnostic groups in his world that were like rejecting the goodness of food, rejecting the goodness of the body, and he's trying to say, no, this we have to be able to eat. God gave us food to eat. It's a good thing. Creation is good. Our created world is good. If God became flesh, then flesh is good too. All of these things are capable of becoming teachers. So food itself can become a teacher to the believer if it's apprehended in the proper way. So it's just, again, and it's always, he always speaks about it as a sickness within the person. And then Evagrius becomes more, I would say, harsher in his rhetoric, as far as I can tell, towards gluttony and calling it a demon that you have to attack. And so it's very much a martial imagery there, and also ordering it, you know, in the way that it's known, then these logismoi. And then Evagrius will be received into the Syriac tradition. So then you'll have someone like Philoxenus, who knows Evagrius in the later generation. And so you have, it's a sort of lineage. And Philoxenus, it's interesting, I mean, perhaps this is a little sloppy to put it like this, but I see him actually as blending Evagrius and Ephraim. So you can kind of see them, the two worlds coming together a little bit in his articulation, his understanding, because he'll speak of very mythopoetically about Sheol being the glutton, for instance, the way that Ephraim does. He'll talk about it in those sense, but he's also talking about discipline of the body, clouding. He'll quote Evagrius saying this Rega Carso will, the desires of the stomach block the vision of God, and that's the problem. When we go further, I have yet to find out. It'll just be interesting. I want to also look at John of Apamea on this topic. I haven't decided if I want to go into the East Syriac authors. Again, there's a way in which this could just spin out of control. There's only so much one can do, but I'm also interested too, I should say, in looking at a little bit into the material culture of associated with food. So for instance, the practice of edible icons in Byzantine culture is very interesting, as well as bread stamps. And so looking at these sort of material objects which had a sanctifying effect on food or the ingestion of these objects. So,
Thank you.
a lot.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have Georgia, and then I also have another question.
Thanks. Another question that just came to my mind. Probably you tackled it a little bit already, but I was wondering, sometimes when it comes to sins or impurity, we hear, especially in Syriac milieu, that there is this idea of contamination, in the sense that if I eat with somebody who's a heretic, then maybe I might get contaminated. Do you see anything like that in your sources? Like if I eat with somebody who's glutton, does it reflect on me, or?
Yes, as Philoxenus talks about this actually.
Okay.
Well, he says it as an accusation that your gluttony could actually contaminate other people. In other words, if you and again, he's speaking to monks, right? So it's important to say. He's in a communal context, basically saying if you are not mindful of your eating practices, it can have a negative effect on the people around you. So they all seem to understand the strong communal dimensions of this vice. It is and it isn't, because on the other hand, it's also the vice that turns inwards. I mean, it's the original. In English, we say gazing at your belly. It's the know nothingness. It's the staring at your stomach all the time. From the idleness associated with that. Instead of turning the meal into an opportunity to become like God, which is what it should be in its ideal form. So I haven't seen the exact language of infection, but certainly the idea that our eating practices don't just affect us, even if we think they do. It very much affects other people around you. And also, and John Chrysostom really just develops this, the effect that luxuriant lifestyles, picky eating, I mean, that's the thing too. If refusing to eat simple foods would also be, for someone like Chrysostom, a form of the vice, because you're only taking real things that taste really good. So you could be, in this case, you could be, you don't have, it has nothing to do with your size as a person. Gluttonous people are just picky eaters that refuse to, they make that the god. So they turn the food itself and a delicious food into an idol, you could say. And there is often in the background the language also of idolatry, because from Paul, the temple being the belly worshiper, that you have to reorient your heart to God, and so that you don't make your stomach the temple.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. My question, which I think is the last, but I think you answered already in a way, is if you include also Latin sources, or this is out of the scope, or it would be too much.
I have to include Augustine, because it's just I'm still a good Catholic girl at heart, even if I work in Syriac. So yes, I'm including Augustine and his discussion of. He's really interesting, because the way he talks about fasting in the Confessions, it's connected to concupiscence, desire, of course, and why is it that he's troubled by the fact that fasting is so hard for him? And so he, in a very Augustinian way, he'll think about that. Like, why is this so hard for me? As soon as I start fasting, all I do is obsess about food, And so he sees the fact that this is so difficult as, as part of the larger human condition. And then, of course, he turns around and uses taste imagery. Late I love thee, I tasted for thee. And that's also very profound in the Confession. So I'm looking at some of those just to see how taste is something like everything, which all the senses which will get redeemed through the incarnation, for Augustine has to be retrained as a way to discern God rather than to lead you away from God.
Okay, thank you very much.
But not. I would love to do. Yeah, this is the thing. I mean, it would be great to do more and more Latin sources. But probably just him.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think if there are no other persons, we can thank again our speaker, and we will meet again next time. I hope to see you all, and enjoy your time in your summer. Thank you.
I will be in Belgium the first week of August attending a Toroyo class. So I'll be closer to some of you. Thank you very, very much for your time. And feel free, my email is on the Marquette University. If you have feedback or ideas, I'd be very grateful for the help. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.